Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. A fight that's under discussion is Kubrat Pulev and Adam Kownacki, and that could potentially be for a vacant title. So the Athletic is reporting that it's under discussion, potentially for a Wilder and Fury rematch card added to that bill, but even in spite of that, if that card didn't go ahead, there could be the potential for that to happen anyway for a vacant title. And as the Athletic reports, it basically says, and if Andy Ruiz Jr. defeats Anthony Joshua on December 7th, the belief is that Ruiz will vacate his IBF heavyweight title, leaving the two top available contenders, Kownacki and Pulev, to vie for the belt. And it's quite interesting because I think many of us, just because of this Cold War that exists between a PBC, who Ruiz fights under that promotional banner, and the WBO, assumed that of the two belts that would potentially be dropped, because right now both are due both for those mandatory challenges, Kubrat Pulev in the IBF and Alexander Usyk in the WBO. Many have assumed that the WBO would be the one that would be dropped, leading to several sort of scenarios and fan theories about what could potentially happen, who Usyk would be ordered to face for the title, and etc. And I think Ruiz dropping the IBF title, that's certainly something that hasn't been discussed as much. So it is quite interesting because if there isn't a title on the line, at this point in time, I don't think Kubrat Pulev has anything to gain by facing Adam Kownacki. It's a good fight, but apart from that, there would be no title on the line. But obviously, if it's for a vacant belt, then it's all on the line. And I think Kubrat Pulev would like that matchup as opposed to potentially, say, an Anthony Joshua if he won, or even maybe Andy Ruiz Jr. Because Adam Kownacki is still on the come up. There's maybe a few question marks, and certainly his resume at the moment. Some decent top 30 type opponents, but as he's approached being a top 10 contender, he hasn't faced anyone at that level. So Kubrat Pulev would be by far and away the best opponent who he would be facing if that was to come to pass. There's a lot of ifs, buts and maybes, and I'll get to the matchup soon if it were to happen. But I think a lot of us have just assumed if the WBO was to be the one that would drop, then obviously Alexander Usyk would be facing someone for it. And there's been talk of Joseph Parker or Derek Chisora. I mean, who knows? Maybe even Tyson Fury, because he's number 2 there. If the Wilder and Fury rematch doesn't happen, maybe he would end up facing Pulev for a vacant title in this scenario. But I can kind of see if everything sort of goes to a plan as sort of been suggested here, what you could end up having is a big event in February with 2 different world titles on the line at 2 different fights. And this is sort of what they're sort of angling at in the story. And if everything was to sort of slot into place like this, and bear in mind this was recorded before the Ortiz and Wilder fight, so who knows, maybe something there will, throw that into asunder. But if they could have a sort of stacked card with 2 heavyweight title fights on it, it would certainly help the pay-per-view, and especially if it's a cross-promotional event with Top Rank and also the PBC, maybe it's simulcast on different networks, say Fox and ESPN, for example. It could end up having a lot of luster and attraction with big heavyweight fights on the card, 2 title fights. And Adam Kownacki, having a shot, a PBC fighter, he's number 3 in the IBF, Kubrat Pulev number 1, number 2 is not rated. It would be a big fight for them, a good co-main event to a potential Wilder and Fury. But as I say, this is all recorded ahead of the Wilder and Ortiz fight, so I'm not going to get too much ahead of myself, but you can kind of see the sort of rationale and the thinking about why they would want to do that, because that would certainly boost a potential event like that. But in boxing, lots of ifs, buts and maybes. But if there is no vacant belt on the line, then obviously Kownacki and Pulev probably doesn't happen at all. And Anthony Joshua, if he wins his belts back, maybe he can work out a deal with the WBO to make them after the IBF, which Pulev has to have his shot by the end of May. And in terms of the matchup itself, I guess it's one of these sort of things where I don't necessarily think that people have really paired a Pulev and Kownacki matchup together. It's not one of the ones that's generally talked about or discussed really at all, but it would be quite interesting. And as I mentioned earlier, Kownacki hasn't faced anyone of the caliber of Pulev, but Pulev at this point in his career how much has he really got left? He's 38 years old. He hasn't necessarily looked fantastic in some of his recent fights. It wasn't, a clinical performance against Bogdan Dinu, nor against Rydell Booker. And he did labour to some extent in that fight. But Kownacki himself is going to be difficult to deal with early on while he's fresh. We've seen in some fights like the one against Charles Martin, for example, he came out fast, threw a lot of punches, but he tired later on. So the danger time in a fight against Kubrat Pulev for Pulev is actually in the first half of the fight. And if he can survive, he can probably take a lot of the later rounds, as Charles Martin did against Adam Kownacki. But there's the potential for something like what happened to Gerald Washington to happen to Pulev, where he just gets overwhelmed by a guy like Kownacki, who has that sort of come forward pressure and just lets his punches fly. He threw something ridiculous like 160 punches in a round and a bit. So if he does end up having a fight with Pulev, the style matchup's quite interesting, because it really would be quite tough early on, and Pulev would need to use his legs and movement. And at 38 years old, and obviously he's aging by the day, how much would he have left approaching 39, if not 39 at the time of the fight? He would have to really rely on his jab, but one of the things that we saw against Rydell Booker that he just refused to do was throw body shots. And if he's going to slow down Adam Kownacki, he would need to do that. That was something that Charles Martin was able to have some success in his fight with Kownacki. He sort of toughed it out early on and took a barrage of punches before starting to work Kownacki over, and he almost won that fight. That was 96-94. I think on all three judges' scorecards to Kownacki against Martin. So he started fast and faded. And I believe that favours Pulev if he can stay in the fight and take it late. But if he can't handle the pressure, well, Kownacki might walk in there, walk him down and take him out. There is the possibility for that. But it's an interesting potential matchup, and one that is under discussion according to reports from The Athletic in particular that I've been citing here for this video. If it came off, and if they ended up having that card in February and there's two heavyweight title fights, that's a pretty decent card. And they want to talk about 1 to 2 million buys for a rematch with Wilder and Fury should it happen. And something like that, adding that to the card, a vacant title, if Ruiz can beat Joshua, vacates the IBF, and then it falls to Kownacki and Pulev to fight for. I like it. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.